What if the most celebrated palace on earth was built not to provide comfort, but to enforce control? When most people think of the Forbidden City in Beijing in the year 1500, they picture an emperor attended by silk-clad servants, presiding over a world of quiet magnificence. That image contains grains of truth, but it removes almost everything that made daily life inside those walls genuinely different from anything a modern person would recognize. The reality involved tens of thousands of people whose lives were entirely governed by rules they had no power to change. Winter temperatures cold enough to freeze standing water inside the rooms, a food system designed first and foremost to detect poison, and women selected from across the empire, who in many cases spent the rest of their lives within those walls, without ever leaving. This is what the Forbidden City actually was in 1500. The palace stood at the center of Beijing, enclosed by a moat 52 meters wide and walls 10 meters high. Inside those walls were close to 1,000 buildings arranged across 72 hectares. To walk from the southern entrance to the northern gate was to cover nearly a full kilometer. The complex was divided into two zones operating by completely different rules. The southern half, the outer court, was the domain of government. The emperor received officials here, presided over state ceremonies, and issued edicts governing an empire of more than 60 million people. Women were almost entirely excluded. No unofficial person ever entered. The northern half, the inner court, was the private residential world of the emperor, his family, the women selected to serve and bear children for the imperial household, and the enormous staff required to maintain all of it. These two halves shared the same outer walls but operated as separate institutions, and the boundary between them was enforced. By 1500, the emperor was the Hongji Emperor, Zhu Yutang, whom historians generally consider one of the more temperate rulers of the Ming Dynasty. His day began before the sun had fully risen. The first people moving through the palace were junior eunuchs assigned to the heating department, who started fires in the external pits connected to underground channels running beneath the floors of the residential buildings. The Forbidden City used a system called floor heating, in which brick-lined channels carried hot air from external furnaces through tunnels beneath the stone floors, warming the surfaces from below. A government office called the Jixin Department managed the supply of firewood and charcoal to keep this system running through winter. The Ming Dynasty coincided with what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age. In Beijing during this period, winter temperatures could fall to between 20 and 30 degrees below 0 Celsius, with more than 150 severely cold days per year. Without the floor heating network and supplemental charcoal braziers in individual rooms, parts of the palace would have been physically dangerous to inhabit in the coldest months. Even with it, the long corridors between buildings were unheated, and the stone courtyards accumulated frost that did not melt until late morning. Moving between buildings in January meant crossing stretches of freezing air each time. Officials summoned to the morning assembly arrived in the outer court before the emperor appeared, often while the sky was still completely dark. The assembly was called Zhao Chao, established by the first Ming emperor as a daily mechanism through which the emperor received reports from his government. More than 1,000 officials could be required to attend a major session. They traveled from their city residences before dawn, navigating dark streets, assembling in the courtyards outside the great ceremonial halls before the emperor's arrival. When the emperor appeared, every official performed the kowtow, a full prostration requiring the forehead to touch the ground. This was not a brief symbolic gesture. It was a complete physical act of submission performed multiple times throughout the ceremony. Officials who arrived late faced flogging under Ming regulations. Historical records describe one case in which an emperor ordered an investigation after noticing declining attendance, and more than 1,100 officials who had claimed illness were sentenced to hard labor when their claims proved false. Another official was fined a month's salary after accidentally coughing in the emperor's presence. The morning audience was an extension of the same total system of control that governed every aspect of life inside those walls. The people who made the palace function daily were the eunuchs. In 1500, tens of thousands worked in the palace system, organized into 24 separate agencies, each responsible for a specific operational domain. There was an agency for ceremonial rites, one for food, one for documents, one for stables, one for seals, one for apparel, one for silverware, one for weapons, one for laundering, one for headgear, one for bronze work, one for textile manufacture, one for the wine supply, and agencies covering additional functions. Each agency had its own internal hierarchy, and the agencies were themselves ranked relative to one another. A eunuch in a lower-ranking agency did not interact professionally with those from higher-ranking ones. The reason the household relied on eunuchs was specific and practical. The inner court housed the emperor's wives, consorts, and concubines. No intact man other than the emperor could remain in those quarters overnight or attend to the women directly, because the authenticity of the imperial bloodline had to be beyond question. Any child born to any woman in the palace had to be verifiably the emperor's. Eunuchs who had undergone castration were the mechanism that made this possible. They could move through the inner court, attend to the women of the household, and remain inside the palace walls at night without creating any ambiguity about paternity. In practice, this access gave senior eunuchs disproportionate influence. The eunuchs who ran the Directorate of Ceremonial, which managed formal written communications between the emperor and the bureaucracy, could determine what information the emperor received and in what sequence. When emperors stepped back from active governance, and several Ming emperors avoided the morning audience for years at a stretch, the senior eunuchs became the functional administrators of the empire. The early 1500s produced one of the most extreme examples. The eunuch Liu Jin rose to such prominence under the Zhengde emperor that he influenced provincial appointments, shaped military decisions, and accumulated wealth estimated in the millions of tiles of silver before his execution when his political position collapsed. Most eunuchs had nothing to do with political influence. The majority performed domestic and logistical work of a specific and repetitive kind. The agencies responsible for the imperial kitchen managed one of the most technically demanding food production systems of any institution in the world at that time. The kitchen was divided into 3 sections: the main kitchen, the tea kitchen, and the bakery. Each section employed a head chef, 5 cooks, a supervisor, and an accountant tracking every ingredient consumed and every dish produced. Each dish bore the name of the cook who prepared it, a safety protocol so that if the emperor became ill, the responsible cook could be identified immediately. The fear of poisoning was institutional. Before food reached the emperor, designated eunuchs tasted it. Serving vessels were made of silver, based on the belief that silver would change color on contact with certain toxins. Dishes were transported covered and carried quickly to minimize heat loss, and the serving sequence was fixed by protocol. Ming imperial cuisine reflected health principles that the dynasty's founder had established. Zhu Yuanzhang, who had come from extreme poverty, built a court tradition treating health and moderation as central values. The imperial menu was grain-centered, with meat occupying a secondary role. Recorded Ming palace dishes include shark fin soup, preparations made with edible bird nests, sea cucumbers, freshwater prawns, and river fish. Peking duck, whose preparation techniques were refined and codified during the Ming period, appeared on official imperial menus. Tribute deliveries from every region of the empire brought local specialties accessible to no other household in China. The menu changed every day without repeating dishes, placing the kitchen staff under continuous pressure to produce varied and technically accomplished food. The emperor typically ate alone, attended only by his personal eunuchs, with breakfast at approximately 8 in the morning, and the main meal around midday. The women brought into the Forbidden City entered through a process that applied in principle to the entire empire's female population. During the Ming Dynasty, the Xiongnu selection required all unmarried women to participate. Only those who were already married or had documented physical disabilities were exempt. Candidates were predominantly between 13 and 16 years of age. Eunuchs traveled from the palace to conduct initial screenings across different regions, evaluating physical attributes, posture, and behavioral disposition. Those who passed were brought to the capital for further evaluation. Women who cleared this stage entered the palace permanently. Their families did not accompany them. Contact with the outside world was severed at the moment of entry and, in most cases, never resumed. Women who entered as teenagers could expect to remain inside those walls for the rest of their productive years, and in many cases for the rest of their lives. Inside the inner court, women were divided into distinct categories with different functions and different daily realities. The empress held formal authority over the entire female population. Below her were the imperial consorts, ranked by titles indicating the degree of the emperor's favor. Below them were the concubines, whose primary function was to bear the emperor's children. The vast majority of women were palace maids, domestic workers organized into specialized bureaus. There was a bureau of palace attendants, a bureau of ceremonies, a bureau of apparel, a bureau of foodstuffs, a bureau of the bedchamber, and a bureau of handicrafts, as well as an office of staff surveillance. Each bureau was a structured workplace where women spent their careers performing a specific category of task. A woman assigned to the Bureau of Apparel spent her working life managing, cleaning, repairing, and storing the imperial family's clothing. A woman in the Bureau of Foodstuffs worked with the kitchen system to handle food preparation and service for the women of the inner court. The work assigned at the start of a woman's palace career determined the shape of her daily existence. For the concubines, daily life was defined less by activity than by managing availability. They lived in assigned quarters in the inner court, which were physically comfortable by any standard available outside the palace. But their freedom of movement was restricted to designated areas, and they had no access to the world outside the walls. Their days were organized around maintaining the skills and appearance the imperial selection system rewarded. Music, calligraphy, painting, and needlework occupied significant portions of each day. These were preparation for the possibility that the emperor might choose to see a given woman. The selection process was formalized and recorded. A eunuch presented the emperor with tablets each bearing the name of an available concubine. The emperor indicated his choice by turning a tablet face down. The selected woman was prepared and carried to the emperor's quarters by eunuchs, then returned to her own apartments before morning. Eunuchs documented each such interaction as part of the systematic management of the imperial bloodline. A significant number of concubines were never selected at any point in their palace lives. The scale of the system, with some emperors accumulating hundreds or thousands of women, meant that most were never called. They maintained their appearance and skills against the diminishing possibility of selection while years passed. Competition among those seeking the emperor's attention generated serious internal conflict. Historical accounts describe intrigues, accusations, and deliberate acts of harm directed at rivals within the inner court. The stakes were concrete. A concubine who bore the emperor's surviving male heir held political significance regardless of formal rank, while one who fell from favor could find her resources reduced and her effective status diminished to something approaching that of the maids around her, all while remaining confined within the same walls. The clothing worn in the Forbidden City was a precise system for communicating rank. The emperor wore imperial yellow, a color forbidden to every other person in the empire. His formal court robes were embroidered with dragons, the number and placement of dragons indicating which ceremony required each robe. The empress wore yellow with phoenix emblems. Officials in the outer court wore robes whose colors communicated their tier within the 9-rank civil hierarchy: crimson for higher ranks, azure and green for the middle tiers. Embroidered medallions on the chest and back of each robe bore bird or animal emblems specifying position exactly. A crane identified a first-rank civil official. A golden pheasant identified the second rank, a peacock the third. Each rank in the sequence carried its own assigned creature. Appearing in a robe of incorrect color or wearing a wrong emblem was a violation of the ritual order the entire court was constructed to express, and it was punishable. Assembling these garments was not a brief process. Each morning, the emperor's dressing was carried out by eunuchs working through a fixed sequence. The outer ceremonial robes were heavy, woven from layered silk and weighted with dense embroidery. Formal headgear required precise positioning. Belts with jade or gold fittings indicated rank and had to be placed at the exact height appropriate for each ceremony. Full ceremonial dressing for the morning audience could occupy a significant portion of the early morning hours. The empress and higher-ranking consorts underwent equivalent preparation. The robes worn for the morning audience were not the robes worn for an afternoon session or an evening banquet. Multiple changes of costume occurred within a single day, with each transition managed by the attendants specifically assigned to that function. The buildings of the Forbidden City were arranged to express a specific understanding of the emperor's position in the cosmic order. The complex was aligned on a north-south axis, with the most important ceremonial structures at intervals along that axis, moving from public in the south to private in the north. The 3 great halls of the outer court, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Central Harmony, and the Hall of Preserving Harmony, stood on a triple-tiered platform of white marble that raised them above the surrounding courtyards. Yellow was the color of the center in traditional Chinese cosmological thought, associated with imperial authority. Red was associated with fortune and protection. The spatial arrangement followed Confucian principles about hierarchy, with lower-ranking structures always positioned in defined relationships to higher-ranking ones. The traditional account that the palace contained exactly 9,199 rooms reflects this framework. The number 10,000 was considered the exclusive domain of heaven, and the emperor's palace was built to contain precisely one fewer than that ceiling. Written communications inside the palace were as tightly controlled as the movement of people. Officials communicated with the emperor through formal documents called memorials, which passed through the Grand Secretariat before reaching the imperial reading table. Access to the emperor was not available on request. Even the most senior official could not simply present himself and expect an audience. Requests required formal submission, review by the appropriate eunuch agencies, and a decision about whether and when a meeting would occur. This arrangement gave the senior eunuchs managing document flow structural importance. They determined what reached the emperor, in what order, and in what context. When emperors were actively engaged with governance, the system worked as designed. When they withdrew, and some Ming emperors avoided the morning audience for periods measured in decades, the eunuch administration became the practical government of the empire, processing documents and managing the bureaucracy with the emperor's formal authority, but without his direct involvement. As evening came, the palace moved into its security sequence. The exterior gates were locked, with keys held by designated officials and formally recorded. The Imperial Guard Corps maintained posts at the gate towers and along the walls through the night. No one could enter or leave the palace or the city without documented permission. Within the palace, the areas where women slept were accessible only to authorized eunuchs. Lower-ranking maids and concubines remained in their assigned areas after dark. Senior eunuchs of sufficient standing could maintain houses in the city, but they were required to return before the gates were sealed each evening. For most people inside the Forbidden City, night simply meant continuing to be where their position had placed them. The heating channels started before dawn continued operating through the night. Eunuchs assigned to overnight fire management checked the system through the dark hours. Charcoal braziers in individual rooms provided supplemental warmth where the floor channels could not fully reach, though the fire risk was real. Palace records document fires caused by unattended charcoal in rooms whose wooden furnishings and partition walls were highly combustible. Water vessels and sand containers were positioned at fixed points throughout the residential buildings. Specific eunuchs were assigned responsibility for ensuring fires were properly banked before everyone slept, and that monitoring continued through the night. Everything described here, the 24 eunuch agencies, the female bureaus, the kitchen and its poison protocols, the heating department, the morning assembly, the concubine selection process, the clothing regulations, and the gate security, functioned as an integrated whole in the year 1500. The emperor stood at the formal center, but no individual could supervise every component in real time. The palace ran itself according to accumulated rules developed over decades, and it continued functioning whether the emperor engaged actively or not. This is what the Forbidden City genuinely was. Not the private residence of a powerful individual, but a self-sustaining institutional structure that required tens of thousands of people to operate, drew resources from every province in the empire, and reproduced its own operation through the continuous training of each new generation of staff entering its gates. The people whose experience of this system was most total were also the least visible in its records. The junior maids who started fires before dawn, the women who entered through the Junu selection at 13 or 14 and spent their adult lives in a single bureau performing a single category of work, the eunuchs assigned to basic domestic tasks who moved through corridors holding unimaginable wealth while owning almost nothing. These individuals left almost no individual trace in the documents that survive. The historical record preserved the operational details of the system they worked inside. The menus, the ranks, the regulations, the punishments. It recorded the names of cooks responsible for each dish and the names of officials punished for coughing at the wrong moment. What it did not record with any regularity was what the people doing that work experienced inside the walls they could not leave. The Forbidden City of 1500 still stands in Beijing today. The moat, the walls, the great halls of the outer court, and the quieter courtyards of the inner court remain open to visitors. Walking through those spaces, a person can see the dimensions of the rooms, the arrangement of the buildings, and the distances between one hall and the next. What no longer exists is the system those spaces contained, the 24 agencies working through their assigned functions, the morning assembly gathering in darkness, the kitchen producing daily changing menus under named cooks, the women living bounded lives in the northern halls, the eunuchs moving through corridors with the weight of an institution that had taken generations to build. For the people inside it in 1500, there was no outside. Those walls were the entirety of the known world.